Well, we want to extend a welcome to everyone this morning. It's not the biggest crowd, but we're not worried about that. Uh, a little bit of recent history may help concerning what we're thinking this morning. Some of us begin to feel and discern that there may be a bit more we could do as a church, and perhaps our teaching ministry and things like this could be expanded a bit and include brethren who may have a particular burden they want to share. They may have had this burden for a while, and for whatever reason they've been unable to share it. Well, we want to try and provide a place for them to share it. We want to try and facilitate and serve them and, speak to them a little bit and find out what they're thinking. But basically, we want to try and give them a place to share. And we're just not looking for people in Mount Zion. We're looking here and we're looking for elsewhere. But lo and behold, we had one in our midst. So our efforts are to try to build up the body here in Mount Zion and in Bemidji. We hope in the future this thing may grow a little bit. But there's something called flying north, and then there's something called flying true north. When you can fly north, but it's not quite accurate. But when you fly true north, then you're flying entirely accurately. And it behooves us as Christians to try and fly true north in the things pertaining to God. To fly true north as Christians, we need to be able to properly analyze what we read and are called to live by in the Word of God. And in doing so, we hope to end up flying accurately toward true north. And this subject this morning, women in the church assembly, what did Paul say and what did Paul mean? We're under somewhat of the opinion that this has not been accurately taught as properly as it should, and and Gary didn't come and say, "Can I do this? I want to do this. Make a place for me." We approached him, so he had this burden on his heart, and we consider him a pretty extraordinary teacher. So we don't want to fly north on this. We want to fly true north. So. Gary Gilbertson has a particular burden that this issue be presented in a true biblical perspective, coming from a diligent analysis of what Paul really said and why he said it. And this is one of the hot button issues, and we're not trying to push any hot buttons or get any controversy going. But are we flying true north on this, or can we adjust our compass a little bit? And I think that's what Gary wants to do as he shares his burden. So I can ask Gary to come forward. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to be here and wanting to talk about something that I've been thinking about, observing in the body of Christ. And so I'm going to make sure I've got a timer on here so that I don't overstay my time here. Looking for a way to do this. Without further ado, I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. Now, you're going to need a Bible because I'm not going to flash up on the screen every verse. It would take up too much of the outline. It would take up too much of our PowerPoint. So what I have is an outline that has been handed out to those that are here. I'm going to have that outline up on the screen for those of you that are seeing this by recording. Here's what it says. It says, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church." Now, I just read that in the King James Version. And that is not because I think that the King James Version is somehow sacred, and that God in some way miraculously has preserved every jot and tittle exactly the way He wanted it in the King James. If you think that, you have not read any of the history of how we got the Bible. So I use King James simply for a very practical reason. I grew up with it. I memorized it. I learned King James, and I think in King James. But it is no better and no worse than any other translation. So whatever one you have hitched your caboose to, it is no better and no worse than any of the other translations. So I want to get that out there, and that we need to go deeper into what we're going to be looking at than just simply what the King James Version says, with all of its commas and with all of its grammar and things like that. Now, as the screen says right now, is what we're after on this subject is, what did Paul say? Then we'll talk about why he said it. But there is no hope for us to understand why he said it if we haven't got it accurately and clearly understood what he said in the first place. If we're just taking our English translation and our 21st century definition of words and using those, we can't help but go wrong. We're going to need to go to something that's much more accurate and reliable than just simply our opinion of what the English words say. And that's why many people have just simply trusted in translators to do so. And they do their best. They do their best. But I want to go a little bit deeper here, and I'm using 3 different sources here. If I want to get the accurate definition of Greek words, I need to look at what the linguistic scholars of Koine Greek say. And in this study, I have used quite a few, but the 3 that I have most specifically, that I use the most, are the ones that you see up on the screen right now. And those 3 are, I use heavily in this study. Kittel, Friedrich, and Bromley, they have put together, using 39 Koine Greek scholars to put their Greek definitions together. James Strong, we know him from Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. And W.E. Vine, he has an excellent Greek-English dictionary. Now, here's what I say about these 3. and I don't, we're just going to get into this soon, but James Strong, if we're looking at the understanding as going into a room and looking around at what's in it, James Strong will get you in the door of what it means. W.E. Vine will get you into the middle of the room. And Kittle, Friedrich, and Bromley will get you a close look at everything that's in there. So there are three that will really help. Now, the thing about words is that they usually mean more than one thing. And I think of words as rail switches. They are rail switches on a railroad track. There's just a little thing, just a little box with a lever on it. And yet that little mechanism can take a whole freight train either to the west coast or the east coast, to up north or down south, depending upon which way you set the rail switch. That's the way with words, is that words, depending upon what definition you use for them, will take the whole understanding in a totally different direction from one another. It's as far as east as from the west, and you go, how did they come to that conclusion? They defined words in a certain way. That's how they came to that conclusion. So we're going to look at each word, and we're going to look at which way to put the rail switch to get it to go in the way that Paul originally intended it to mean. All right. There's only 55 words in this section, only 55 words, but there is no passage in the Scriptures that has exercised scholars, pastors, teachers. They stretched their creativity to come up with some way to make these 55 words line up with the whole counsel of God in the Scriptures. And there has been lots of the very people who declare that 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 are not relevant for today, that they ceased, that there's no more of those things, or at least most of the things in those chapters just they ceased for some reason. They are the very ones that will take these two verses out of all the verses in those chapters. They'll take these two verses and they will vehemently claim that these two verses, excluding all the rest of the verses, that these two verses are not only relevant for today's church, but are an eternal prohibition for all women at all times. One scholar said about these three chapters, he said, these special spiritual gifts will pass. They will automatically cease of themselves. But he's the same guy who says in just a few paragraphs later, certainly women are still under subjection, or at least they ought to be. Another guy says, all these subjects in 12, 13, and 14 was done away with when the canon was completed about AD 100. But he's the same guy that says all the churches are governed by the same principle of conduct. The command seems absolute. Women are not to do any public speaking in the church. So there's just this double standard, this kind of illogical pick and choose kind of thing, said in an authoritative way to the point where people believe it. But I'd like to dig a little deeper into that. Paul expects us to understand the context here. He hasn't started a brand new, like out of the clear blue sky. Suddenly he just gets this idea to drop a prohibition on women into the midst of everything that he's talking about. Like he started a new subject. He didn't start a new subject. He's still talking about the same subject he was talking about for the last 7 or 8 verses. And he expects the reader to be able to stay with the understanding of the context instead of just simply believing or wrongly concluding that he's starting a new subject about women. He's not. The context has to do with verse 29 of that chapter. If you look at that verse says, let the prophets speak, 2 or 3, and let the others judge. There's a lot in that little phrase there, and we don't realize it on a first reading, is that at that point, Paul's subject is prophecy in the public meeting. From that point down to the end of verse 35, the subject is prophecy in the public meeting. The first instructions he gives is let the prophets speak, 2 or 3. And then for the next 4 verses, what does he do? He talks about what it means for prophets to speak 2 or 3. In other words, let them take turns and humbly submit to each other. But then he, after that 4-verse digression to talk about let the prophets speak 2 or 3, he then elaborates on what he means by and let the others judge. And that is where he is coming back to let the others judge in verse 34 and 35. And he says, let the women. Let the others judge and let the women. That's what he is after. And I want that connection to not be lost. If you lose that connection, then you end up someplace where the Lord never intended your train to go. We're finding out what Paul really said. Later, we would get to, as Paul does, we will get to why he said it. So the first word, and I'm going to go first word, and then word by word in here because it opens up. It's like Mary Poppins' carpet bag. It's just a little thing, but boy, is it full of stuff. Let. That's the first word in our King James Version there. Let. Now the word let is not found in the Greek text. You won't find the word for let in the Greek text. It's just simply not there. It was added. It was added by translators. Let should be ignored because let gives a subtle but powerful implication that men let women do things, or they don't let women do things. And it implies that there is a permission that women have to have in order to do whatever. You have to let them or not let them. They need to be controlled. And I think it needs to be ignored because that's subtle. It says, well, this is too subtle. That's the stuff that our attitudes are made out of, is subtleties like that. So let is the word that should be ignored because it means that men must decide what women say and what they don't decide. Men do that. And think about that for a second. If a Christian man really believed that it was up to him to enforce silence upon women, what could he possibly do to make them do that, to be silent, that would line up and be consistent with the nature of God that he claims to have the Spirit of? God doesn't make people do things, neither should we. Let your women implies ownership. Men own women. Let your women. And the word your is not found in the Greek text either. Should be ignored. There is a word, however, that should be put into place, and that word is the Greek word for you. You women is what the phrase actually says. You women. So that's the first words that Paul says. So he's actually addressing the women. He's not addressing men who own women, men that give permission or not permission to women. He's saying, you women. And the word women is the next one. Yes, there's the word women. And interestingly enough, Greek being such an articulate language, here's something that the word for women is gune. And Greek does not have a word for wives. It's the same word, gune. So this word women, you women, can either be you women, all women, every woman, or it can be you wives. And the only way that you can tell, usually this is the way English goes, but this is the way Greek goes. The only way you can tell whether he's saying you women or you wives is to look at the context that surrounds it. And lo and behold, what do we find in verse 35? We find a contextual cue that says, let them ask their husbands. Now, if a woman, a gune, asks her husband, that makes her a wife. That makes her a wife. So what we have is that Paul is addressing wives in this passage here. Remember, it's in the context of judging prophecy, and he's saying, you wives. And the next statement is keep silence. Oh, you know what? I keep on forgetting to do this. I'm not really good at this kind of stuff. So we have the context, let your women, and there we go. For those of you watching this, you'll have to forgive my ineptitudes. This is my first rodeo. The word that I am after now is keep silence. Now, the word for keep silence is sigaio, and I'm not going to get into a big Greek lesson here. It just simply means, it doesn't mean not a word out of you. It means to keep secret. It means a voluntary refusal or indisposition to speak. That's what keep silence means. It is not a word. It is don't make a sound. It is not sit down and be quiet. It is that women are to voluntarily keep something secret and voluntarily refuse to talk about it. Wow. Okay. So that's a rail switch, right? It takes you in a different place than what is commonly assumed that it should take you. And we'll see many of those along the way. Now, here's some other places. Luke 9:36. Luke 9:36, we find that Peter, John, and James were on the Mount of Transfiguration. They saw all kinds of stuff. They came down from the mountain, and what did they do? They sigioed. They voluntarily kept it secret. They voluntarily refused to speak about what they had experienced on the Mount of Transfiguration. Another one is Romans 16:25. Lo and behold, we've got God Himself. First one, where God Himself voluntarily refused to speak of the gospel of Jesus Christ until the right time. He kept it secret from before the world ever, kept it secret since the world began, is what it says there. If God Himself voluntarily keeps things secret, can women do that? In fact, does God ask them to do the same thing He does? Yeah, that's what is being talked about here. The chief priests and scribes in Luke, they voluntarily refused to speak in front of the people about their criticisms of Jesus. So he had a different motive going on there. They kept it secret for ill motives along the way. So this word for keep silence is it takes you in a different way. There is no reasonable person who would conclude that the instructions in verse 28 of chapter 14, where it talks about it says, it's talking about people that speak in tongues. It says, if there is no interpreter, let him voluntarily refuse to speak. It's the same word. No reasonable person would say that, okay, that tongue speaker can never, under any circumstances, speak again in the church assembly. Okay? Then you've got verse 30, where it says the same thing about prophets. It says, if they're prophesying and somebody else has something that's been revealed to them, let the first one voluntarily not speak anymore. No reasonable person would say that first person is never allowed to prophesy ever again in the fellowship. That's totally unreasonable to say that, okay, let the prophet voluntarily keep silent. That means forever, in all circumstances, every time the church assembles, you can't speak anymore. But that's the logic, that's the whacked out logic that is used about the word, let women voluntarily keep silent, is that it's forever, under all circumstances, no matter what assembly there is, they can never speak. That's unreasonable. That's not what Paul said. But that is the kind of thing that goes on in the minds and attitudes of otherwise very intelligent people. So what she has voluntarily refused to speak about and to keep secret has not been divulged yet. Stay tuned. It will. It will come. Okay. In the churches, the Greek word for churches is ekklesia. Ekklesia does not mean synagogue. Ekklesia means, it's the Greek word that the church adopted that means to call out, the called out. And it simply means in Greek, and because Corinth is a Greek place, Paul was talking to them. Now, ecclesia simply meant to call the citizens out to the town square to discuss town business. That same word is the word that is used by Paul here for when the church gathers together, is that they're called out of their homes. They are not, as 2 Corinthians 6:17 says, where it says, "Come out from among them and be separate." That is not the same word. To say that in the church means the cosmic church, that there is something about the cosmic church, and that if women speak, they haven't come out of the world, or the church hasn't come out of the world. That's irrational thinking. And otherwise rational people buy into that. It's not a synagogue. There are many that have interpreted this scripture based on a synagogue model. They said that the church in Corinth met in a synagogue model where the women sat on one side, the men sat on the other, and that when it comes to speaking, what they really were talking about is that women were yelling across the synagogue to ask their husbands questions in the middle of the meeting. It's total fiction. Okay, they did not meet in synagogue style. For it is not permitted unto them. This is again one of those places where it is reinforced in many's mind that women are owned by men, and that men will give permission or will not give permission for women to speak. And it's all up to them. Women should be seen and not heard. The word for permitted is, it means to give opportunity to. Let's see if I can go on here. Commanded to be, okay, let's go back here. For it is not permitted. We got the word there, and it means to give opportunity. It also means something else that I want to get in here that's not on the handout, is that it means to turn over to. To turn over to. So what he's saying is that the opportunity is not turned over to wives. There's an opportunity that is not turned over to wives. They're not to be given, that it is not turned over to them to speak in a very specific, narrow situation and circumstance. And that's the next word in here, to speak. The Greek word for speak is laleo. And this is the place where people have gone wrong with the idea that the Corinthian church met. Let's see. I didn't. Not prevented them to speak only under certain specific things, and it's entirely up to them. If men thought that they had the responsibility to not give women the opportunity or not turn over to women a place to speak, what would they do? What would they do? And how would they do it? That would be honoring God and displaying God's character and intent. What would they do? And this is the part where it's just been there's been a development of ways to keep women from speaking. And would they tie them up? Would they hit them? Would they send them out? Would they usher them out? What would they do? That would be in God's nature. But see, nobody thinks about that. They only think about this thing that says right here. It says right here. And I'm just the guy to enforce it. No. Now, the next word in there is to speak. And I haven't got it. Forgive me, I haven't got it on the overhead yet. And the word speak is not to. This is the synagogue thing I'm getting back to. Is that in the synagogue model, they said that women were yelling across the room to their husbands, asking them, "What does he mean?" Or "I don't get that." Or "Who does he think he is?" Or whatever they're yelling across the room, and they define the word speak as babbling, chattering, interrupting, and questioning. Where did they get that? The word speak doesn't mean any of those things. Laleo doesn't mean any of those things. What does laleo mean? It means to tell. And it also means to speak of something. So what women are not given the opportunity to do is tell something. There's something that they know that they're not permitted to tell. That's what it's all about right here. And remember that it's in the context of judging prophecy. So speak means to tell or to say something in a very specific situation and under specific circumstances. They are commanded to be. Wow. Now you talk about loaded. They are commanded to be. Now here's the truth of the matter is, the words "they are commanded" you will find nowhere in the Greek text. They are commanded. Those words simply are not there. Paul never wrote or intended for anybody to think that he said they are commanded. No, it's not there at all. And those three words must be ignored if we're going to keep our freight train going in the direction that God intended for it to go and the way that Paul intended it to go. It's very damaging to both men and women to think that women are commanded by Paul or commanded by God to not say a word. That is extremely damaging. It's an attempt to coerce women into not speaking that isn't found in the Scriptures at all. Some have used 1 Corinthians 14:37. You can look down on that, where it says, you must acknowledge that the things that I write unto you are the commandments of the Lord. Right? And they're saying, well, this is exactly what it says. It says the commandment of the Lord is that women should not speak in a public meeting. But what they're doing is they're justifying the wrong addition of words to the Scriptures. What did God command? Whatever He said in verse 34 and 35 of 1 Corinthians 14 is the commandment of the Lord. But what did He say? He did not say that anybody was commanded by God or by Paul. It's just not there in the verses. This is the way you get domestic abuse, is when men start believing that they're justified by God to make women submit and be quiet. So what we have left in there is a better translation. In one version says, let them subject themselves. But we're going to get to that word subject here as well. But first of all, this thing is that there is no command. This is voluntary stuff. And there is nothing that men are allowed to do to make them. The next word is they're commanded to be under. The word under is got 17 different meanings. You talk about a rail switch word. The word under can, depending upon which way you set the word under, which way you define the word under, it can take you one of 17 different places. You talk about a rail yard, a hub. This word is one of those right there. It can mean everything from forced subjection and inferior to others. It can mean forced subjection, inferior to others, all the way over to the other end where it can mean concealment beneath the surface. Those are, and there's everything in between on that. We need to look at some of the places where it talks about this word, and the word under, it cannot mean inferior. It cannot mean forced subjection. And I just put down a couple places. The first one, and it didn't get on the outline, is right up in that same chapter in verse 26, where it says, every one of you has a psalm of doctrine. And it goes on from there. But it's every one of you. Does that mean every one of you men? That would be putting the Scriptures on the rack again and making them say what you want them to. Every one of you means you all of you have these things. So it is not Paul does not intend for under to mean that you are forced into not saying a word. Also in Acts, there was 120 disciples, Acts 1:14 and 15. See if I'm on track. It says that they were all in one accord, and it says there was 120 disciples, both men and women. Their synagogue mentality left. They were not meeting in synagogue fashion. They were in one accord. They were together on this thing. No one was under anyone else. Galatians 3:26 and 28 states that you are all children of God, neither male nor female. You are all one in Christ. It's been breathtaking for me to read and listen to teachers, the gymnastics they will go through to say that, yeah, we're all one in Christ, but we're not one in Christ. Women are different. Women are inferior. You thought that went out with the Dark Ages? Still amongst us very badly. Okay. Actually, what the word under means is the other side of this thing, where it means beneath the surface, behind the scenes, beneath the surface like a foundation, behind the scenes like a stage manager. That's what under is what Paul is after in this one, is when he says, women, be voluntarily in the position of being a stage manager, being a foundation, a strong support, like the iron girders under a bridge, not seen, but without them, everything collapses. Foundations, not necessarily seen, but without them being strong, things collapse. People collapse. Husbands collapse. They collapse without their wife being under. It's a noble and holy and right thing to be doing, is to be under, in the sense of beneath the surface and a strong support behind the scenes. In Genesis, let's see if I got that on here. Let's go to the next. No, I don't have it on my outline here. It just says that in Genesis 2:20, Eve hadn't even been created yet, and God says, I'm gonna make a woman, and she will be a help meet for him, Mr. Blockhead over here. Help meet. What does it mean? Let's see. Did I get that on here? Help meet in Hebrew means one who rescues, surrounds, and protects. That's what Eve was to be for Adam. Now, interestingly enough, that sounds a lot like being a strong supporter under the surface. very similar ideas between the word helpmeet and the word for under that is used by Paul. The interesting thing about this word is that God Himself, if you're looking throughout the Scriptures, you'll find that God Himself is called the helpmeet, something like 14 different times, where it says, my help cometh from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Well, guess what that word is? The same word that is used for Eve in Genesis. My rescue, my protection, my support comes from the Lord. Eve was assigned the same task that God assigned to Himself. We'll talk more about that in a little while, but let's take a look at the next word, under obedience. Under obedience. This word has been seriously damaged. By both secular institutions and the church. This word hupotasso is the Greek word there. It's a compound word. Under being the first part of it, hupotasso is the second part. Under obedience has been most often interpreted by the church as a military term. And they cite the centurion that Jesus was talking to, where the centurion says to Jesus, I am a man under authority. And the word there is hupotasso. It's the same word. And this has, they painted every time hupotasso is used with the same brush. They say if it meant under authority, like in the military, where there is a private, the one who just simply obeys, doesn't even think for himself, and then there's the commander over them. And they have taken this same idea of commander and private, and they have made it that the commander is the husband and the private is the wife. And that's the definition and understanding that most people have. And they use words, very harsh words like subordinate in different translations, submit, subjection, subjugation. Terms like that are used in our modern English translations. There is something bleeding through into the translations from translators and interpreters that is quite biased. Hupotasso has nothing to do with being inferior, has nothing to do with forced subjugation. Hupotasso, the second part of that, we know that under means behind the scenes, strong supporter. Tasso means, am I getting there yet? Tasso, on the very bottom, it cannot mean forced subjection. And there I have cited a number of verses, and for time's sake, I'm not going to go through all of those there, but we're talking about the word tasso and how it's used in other places of the Scriptures. It does not ever mean inferior. It does not ever mean you are the private, I am the commander. It never means that. The word tasso itself always means something entirely different. And men are required to hupotasso just as much as women are. And I cite verses up there for that. But the thing about the word tasso is that it means, I refer to my three buddies that all the time. Here's what it means. It means to, tasso means to organize or arrange special details in an orderly manner. Let me say that again. It is huge rail switch word here from what is normally understood. It means to organize or arrange special details in an orderly manner, behind the scenes as a strong supporter. That's what hupotasso is. Men are to do the same thing as women in many, many other places in the Scriptures. Okay, there's just a lot that I'm going to skip over there, but I'm going to get to this part. The next one, as also saith the law. Wow. This is the place where they say, this justifies me. This justifies me in anything I want you to do and anything I don't want you to do. Right here. So Paul pulls out the big guns right here. And he doesn't say, this is my opinion, this is what I think should happen. He says that this is in the law. Well, the law, of course, is the entire Old Testament. It's not just the 5 books of Moses. Newsflash. You can look at it from one end to the other, and you will find that there is not even an implication or hint that women must remain silent in the assembly. It's just not in there. If it was there, the military-minded men would have found it. It's not there. So they got a couple of places that they go to. One is Genesis chapter 3:16, where it says that he shall rule over you. Part of what God said would happen to Eve. Adam would rule over you, and they transpose that into meaning men will rule over women. Thing is that it doesn't say anything about women being silent. And the other thing that they definitely don't want anybody to think about is that he shall rule over you is the outcome of sin. He shall rule over you is what happens when men sin. Look at that place in chapter 3. You will see it. Is that when he says he shall rule over you, it's because he sinned that would happen. There's another place where it says they take, and it says is in Genesis 2:20. Got the wrong address on there. It says Adam was created first. Okay? Adam was created first, and therefore women should be silent and men should tell them when and when they cannot speak. This is what we would call immature logic. This is what you get from little kids who say, I was here first and I'm older than you are, so I get to decide what you do. And the thing about ruling over is that you have to use illogical reasoning. You have to not understand the whole picture in order to come up with these two scriptures as a justification for as also saith the law. It doesn't say that in those places or any place else. Well, is Paul letting his Pharisaical heart bleed through? He really hated women and he was still a Pharisee in his heart of hearts? No, no way. Hupotasso means arranging oneself in a strong and orderly support, taking care of the details behind the scene, in support of. And lo and behold, right there in Genesis chapter 2, there is a place where the law says exactly that. It's Genesis 2:18. Genesis 2:18, it says, she shall be a helpmeet for him. And I said that before, is that helpmeet, what that really means is a rescuer, protector, a surrounder. Is very close to being a strong support behind the scenes. So that's the place in the law that seems reasonable to believe that Paul was talking about, is that the place in the law where women are to be a hupotasso is right there where it says, she will be a helpmeet for him. 15 other times in the Old Testament, I was looking for this, that God himself is a helpmeet. Because God is not inferior, God is not weak, God is not gullible, God is not stupid, neither are women. Specifically in this passage, neither are wives. So if she's supposed to be a strong supporter underneath that voluntarily keeps something secret, what in the world could that something be? It has to do, and we will get there in a little while, but I'll just have to say again that we're talking about a very specific and limited situation where this is to be the case. Wives, you can rescue your husband or you can destroy him by what you know. Yeah, you know it. Your husbands are the only one that don't know it. You can protect him or you can throw him to the dogs by what you know about his weaknesses, his sins, yes, even his strengths. So if this is in the context of prophesying and judging prophecy, and it says, let the others prophesy, what is a wife supposed to do when a man gets up and prophesies? And the others are then required and have the liberty to judge, to sort out, even right there, according to what Paul is saying here, even right there, to sort his prophecy out, what is his wife supposed to do? She is supposed to remain a strong supporter underneath him by voluntarily not telling what she thinks. That's what Paul is talking about here. It's that when prophecy is being judged, the wives of those men who prophesy should remain no body language going, I tell you, you want to destroy your husband? Just wait till he gets up to deliver something he feels the Lord has put on his heart. And she's sitting there going, oh boy, not again. You have the power, and wives, you know it. But I am just amazed at how much wives protect and rescue and surround their husbands, even when they don't deserve it. Even when they should be thrown under the bus. Even when they should be called into account. But relax, because there is people that are already assigned to take care of that in the public meeting. You will get your chance, wives. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:7 says this. Let's see if I've got it on here. Yeah. She has intimate knowledge. I'm sorry, this was all on there and I just went on through. Is intimate knowledge. You that are on watching this, you can pause it and look at this if you'd like. Okay, so Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:7, he says, love bears all things. I thought it was really interesting. I found out what bears means. Bears means three things from my three buddies. It means, listen to this, to keep silent about unfavorable things that might be harmful to others if uttered. Ooh. Men too. Love covers all things quietly. Love preserves by covering with a cloak of love. So this is not just me pulling something out of the hat. This is actually the essence and foundation of love, is to quietly cover it. This is not a suppression of truth. Say, well, it's the truth. He's a jerk, or he's or whatever. It's not. Wives are so kind; they wouldn't say it that way most of the time. But they would say, well, it is the truth. What he said up there in the meeting is not the way his life doesn't line up with that. He doesn't practice what he preaches. Wives can be very disgusted about that, and they can be tempted to find a way to say that, and they are not supposed to. If prophecy is going to be edifying, you could wreck a whole good word from the Lord. Wives, you've got it in your power to do it. You've got it in your power to do it. And don't do it. Don't do it. Why? Because he's so honorable? Because he is so good at everything? Because he's perfect? No. But because you love the Lord, and the Lord wants to edify the church. Now, Just because it doesn't say anything about men being quiet when their wives prophesy, husbands being quiet. Oh, by the way, everybody understands that wives prophesy in the public assembly. They do. And there's freedom for them to do so. Scriptures support that. So when a wife prophesies in the meeting and she brings to the fellowship what she has been given by the Lord to report to the body, does the husband get to chime in and say whatever he feels like? No. Just because it doesn't say husbands need to be quiet when their wives prophesy doesn't mean that it's not in the Scriptures to do so. We got Ephesians 5:21. Let's see if I've got that up here. No. Ephesians 5:21, where it says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of the Lord. The word submitting is hupotasso, means to be a strong support beneath the surface by remaining quiet. Is that just women? No, it's all. It's men included in that. Philippians, or 1 Peter 5:5, all of you be subject, hupotasso, to one another and be clothed with humility. Men, you need to be subject to your wives as well, especially when they prophesy. You don't say a word, one way or the other. It must be pointed out here that there is no limits placed on wives to refrain from participating in the evaluation and judging of prophecy by other husbands, by other women. Wives, you are free to be one of the others that judges. In all other situations except for this one narrow place, which is when your husband has prophesied. And prophecy, of course, I just want to clear that up. Prophecy, its quick and dirty definition is it's to report to the fellowship something that God has placed in your mind for the body. And at that point, I'm going to just take a break now for just a few minutes, and we'll get back and take a look at verse 35 next.